She told him to kneel, right there, on the stones of Buckingham Palace, in front of tourists, cameras, his own brothers in red. "Kneel to your queen," Camilla commanded. But what she didn't expect was that the guard would speak. And what he said next, it didn't just break protocol, it shattered the silence the monarchy depends on. So before we show you the exact moment the crown fractured in front of hundreds, make sure you're subscribed with the bell icon turned on. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because when the Queen Consort tried to rewrite the history with a single command, a royal guard stood taller than the crown itself. The sky above Buckingham Palace was cloudless that morning, not a single wisp to soften the blue. The kind of perfect ceremonial weather that looked almost staged, like the clouds themselves had been briefed on protocol. Beyond the black iron railings, tourists pressed forward with phones raised, voices hushed. Union Jacks fluttered from the poles along the Mall, and somewhere in the distance a brass quartet played something vaguely royal and forgettable. It was supposed to be routine, a short walkabout. Queen Camilla greeting foreign delegates from the Commonwealth. Limited press, controlled access, minimal disruption. The guard rotation had been standard. Nothing in the orders hinted at trouble. Sergeant Alistair Grange stood exactly where he was meant to stand, 5 meters inside the rope line, adjacent to the south forecourt arch. Grenadier Guard, mid-30s, posture flawless, face unreadable beneath the tall black bearskin that made him look 7 feet tall. His red tunic gleamed in the sun, buttons aligned like medals, rifle at his side, hands locked in position. To the crowd, he was scenery. To those who'd seen his file, he was something else. 2 tours in Helmand, Bronze Star from Allied Command, personally selected by Queen Elizabeth II to return to ceremonial duty after an injury no one talked about. A guardsman who'd earned his silence, not just been trained into it. What most people didn't know, what no tourist with a camera could ever capture, was that Grange had stood in this exact position 3 years earlier when the Queen herself had walked past. She'd paused, just for a moment, and said something so quiet only he could hear it. "Thank you for coming home." Nothing more. No ceremony, no cameras. Just acknowledgement from a woman who understood what standing still really cost. He'd carried those 4 words through every ceremonial shift since, through every tourist who knocked on his bearskin for a photo, through every dismissive comment about toy soldiers. They weren't toy soldiers. They were men who'd chosen to stand again after war had tried to break them. The click of heels on stone changed the air first. Queen Camilla emerged from the palace's private south door, flanked by aides and 2 press handlers carrying umbrellas to block the sun, even though there wasn't a cloud in sight. She wore a pastel blue coat dress, pearl earrings, and a wide-brimmed hat, tilted just dramatically enough to draw attention without seeming like she was trying. Her smile was tight, polished, practiced in a mirror somewhere expensive, but her pace gave her away. The aides noticed it first. She walked half a step ahead of the planned route, drifting like someone bored with the choreography. She was supposed to follow the front perimeter for a short meet and greet with selected guests. Instead, she veered. 1 step offline, and then 2. Then a deliberate swerve toward the guard rotation. A tall aide in a grey suit whispered to the woman beside him, but didn't speak aloud. They both recognized the pattern. Camilla had done this before, when bored, when agitated, when in the mood to make a point no one asked her to make. "She's veering," the aide muttered. Another replied quietly, "Don't engage. Let her tire herself out." But she wasn't tiring, she was charging, not physically but with intent. She moved past the railing and cut diagonally across the forecourt, heading straight for Sergeant Grange. The crowd noticed instantly. Tourists stopped mid-scroll, phones tilted in her direction. A few lowered entirely, sensing the shift. Camilla's eyes didn't wander. They locked onto the guard ahead of her, the one who hadn't flinched, hadn't blinked, hadn't acknowledged a single inch of her deviation. That apparently was the problem. She stopped 3 feet from his position and smiled, not kindly, not warmly, but with the slow, thin smile of someone looking to provoke a reaction just to see what happens. The aides stayed back. No one said a word. The brass music faded into background hum. Buckingham Palace held its breath. Camilla tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of her pale blue hat. She didn't speak at first, just stood in front of Sergeant Grange, like she was inspecting an artifact in a museum, something old and stiff and dusted for display. He didn't move, not even a flicker, just the clean stillness of a man trained not to flinch under pressure. In Helmond, in London, anywhere. Finally her voice broke the silence, soft, deliberate, audible to anyone within 10 feet. "Well," she said, still smiling for the tourists nearby, "do you stand there pretending to matter, or are you just another relic from your late Queen's Museum of Old Britain?" The words weren't loud, but they landed like thunder. A few guests near the front rail inhaled sharply. One woman gasped. Camilla's smile didn't waver. Behind her, aides exchanged glances. One stepped forward slightly, maybe to redirect her back onto the planned route, but a sharp glance from Camilla stopped him cold. Grange didn't answer. His eyes remained forward, posture unchanged. Camilla took another step closer, the toe of her heel nearly brushing the tip of his polished boot. "No blink," she murmured. "No twitch. No humanity left behind those eyes. They really did train you to be furniture." Still nothing. The crowd went silent. Not the polite hush of ceremony, but the tense quiet that tightens around your ribs. Even the pigeons seemed to know better than to land nearby. Camilla's tone changed, louder, sharper. "Is that what you call duty?" she asked, gesturing lazily at his bearskin hat, "wearing this absurd costume like it means something." Still nothing. Then she stepped in just a fraction closer and said coldly, "Elizabeth's era is over. You're standing for a ghost." That's when Sergeant Grange moved. Not his feet, not his weapon, but his voice. Controlled, measured, clear and resonant as a rifle crack on parade ground stone. "My duty is unchanged, ma'am." His eyes didn't shift. His lips didn't quiver. It wasn't protest. It wasn't defiance. It was fact. Camilla recoiled slightly, as if the sound itself had touched her. "Oh?" she replied, turning slightly toward the gathering crowd. "Then your duty must be to entertain tourists." Like a wind-up doll. More phones were raised now, some filming openly, others shielding lenses behind handbags or jackets. Aides froze, unwilling to step between their queen and a man in full regalia who had just unmistakably spoken out of turn. Camilla looked him over once more, top to bottom, like he was beneath consideration now. Then she chuckled. "A costume and a script. That's what you are. A tradition for tourists, nothing more." She turned her body toward the audience, not away from confrontation, but toward a wider stage. The guard said nothing more. Not yet. But the air was changing, and the Queen Consort wasn't finished. Camilla took a half step back from Sergeant Grange, turning fully now to face the tourists behind the rope line. Her smile returned, wider this time, artificial, laced with performance. If her earlier comments had been barbed whispers, what followed was a full broadside. "Take a good look, all of you," she said, voice loud enough to carry across the courtyard. "This is what the monarchy used to be." Statues dressed in dead tradition. Some in the crowd let out awkward chuckles. Others didn't react at all, unsure whether this was satire, sarcasm, or something genuine. But the aides behind her stiffened visibly. The Foreign Office liaison's jaw clenched. The air rippled like heat off stone. Camilla's voice hardened. "My mother-in-law adored this kind of thing. The parades, the silence, the pomp. But we don't live in the 1950s anymore, do we?" She turned back toward Grange. "And yet, here you are," she said, gesturing with an open palm, "pretending to be part of something sacred. As if standing still in red makes you more than a leftover costume from a dying empire." The words landed like stones. Grange still didn't move, not a blink, not a flick of his rifle, not a shift in posture. But his voice came again, quieter this time, not for the tourists, but for her. "Ceremony is not finished," he said. "Legacy is not finished. And loyalty does not vanish because you mock it." Camilla's expression shifted. The laughter faded. The facade cracked. Her hands dropped to her sides, fingers curling slightly. "You're loyal to a corpse," she snapped, her voice now sharp and personal, "to a woman who thought she could prop up the crown with flowers and silence." That drew gasps, real ones, audible and raw. A child near the front asked, "Mummy, what did she say?" And the mother quickly shushed her. Camilla continued, tone venomous now. "This country needs strength, movement, power, not stone-faced men in feathered hats saluting ghosts." She circled slightly around the guard, like a critic examining a flawed statue. "Elizabeth clung to this theatre like it meant something, but I won't. I refuse to let Britain be held hostage by costumes and silence." Another aide moved toward her, whispering urgently, "Ma'am, the cameras—" But she shook him off. She was riding her own momentum now, contempt pouring out unchecked. Sergeant Grange remained unmoved. "I don't serve theatre," he said, just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I serve the crown." Camilla laughed once, a bitter barking sound that echoed too sharply in the silence. "You think they're different?" She leaned in slightly, the brim of her hat nearly brushing his bare skin. "They're not." She stepped back again, arms crossed, smile gone. "You think you're standing for legacy?" she asked coldly. "Then prove it." The crowd sensed it before she said it. Something dangerous building. And then, clear as the toll of a bell, she spoke the words no guard had ever been commanded before. Queen Camilla stood square in front of Sergeant Grange now, heels planted hard against the courtyard stone. Her breath was sharp. Her posture had stiffened, not from poise, but from pride. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't care about the cameras. Her focus was solely on the man in red. And then she said it, loud enough for the entire forecourt to hear. Clear enough that even those in the back stopped mid-scroll on their phones. "Then kneel." A hush spread like wildfire. She repeated it, slower this time. "Kneel to your queen. Right now. Prove your loyalty, not to her," she gestured vaguely toward the palace behind them, "but to me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Aides froze mid-step. One tourist's phone audibly slipped from their hand and cracked on the stone. The rope line shuddered as onlookers leaned forward. It was a command no guard had ever received, not in 2 centuries of tradition. Not on any parade ground, not from any sovereign, and certainly not like this. Behind Camilla, her lead aide, a career palace official who'd served under 3 monarchs, went pale. He knew what she'd just done. The guards didn't kneel to living royals, not at ceremonies, not at coronations, not ever. They stood. That was the entire point. They were the unchanging constant, while crowns passed from head to head, while governments rose and fell, while the world outside the gates shifted and fractured. The red tunic and the bearskin and the rifle were symbols precisely because they did not bend. She'd just ordered the breaking of an oath older than the crown she claimed to represent. In the press gallery, a veteran royal correspondent whispered to her cameraman, "She doesn't understand what she's asking." Another replied, "She understands. She just doesn't care." Grange's rifle did not move. His chin did not dip. His fingers did not twitch. For 3 long seconds, he stood perfectly still, eyes locked forward, as if nothing had been said. But something was happening behind his eyes. Not doubt, not fear, a calculation. He'd made harder choices in Helmand, when the wrong decision meant body bags. This was different. This was about what he'd carry for the rest of his life. If he knelt now, he'd be kneeling forever. Not just to Camilla, but to every dismissal of what the uniform meant, every reduction of service to spectacle, every future royal who mistook ceremony for servitude. But then, softly, firm enough to carry, yet stripped of all theatre, he answered, "I kneel only to God, and I stand for the crown that your late queen swore to protect." The sentence hit the stone like a gavel. The air vanished. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Did he just?" Phones rose in unison. Aides didn't move. Tourists froze. Even the guards at the opposite end of the forecourt, trained to ignore all disruptions, turned their eyes. Camilla blinked once. Her lips parted. Not in awe, not in anger, in disbelief. She had expected silence. Maybe a blink of hesitation. She had not expected scripture. She had not expected loyalty sharper than defiance. She stepped back once, then forward again, eyes narrowed, nostrils flaring. Her voice dropped lower, but the fury made it cut deeper than before. "You would quote God to me like a preacher in costume," she hissed. "You stand there in wool and brass and think you have the right to decide who commands your loyalty." Grange didn't answer. He didn't need to. His words still echoed. "I kneel only to God." Camilla turned to the aides behind her. "Well," she barked, "he just refused a direct royal command. Remove him. Strip his weapon. I want him off post before the hour ends." But the aides didn't move. Not one. Because they knew what she didn't. He hadn't broken a single rule. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't touched a soul. And in the silence between her command and his reply, he had become the voice of something far older and far stronger than her authority. The rope line was whispering now. The press were filming openly. Tourists held their breath. And in the middle of it all, Sergeant Grange stood taller. Camilla's breath hitched in her throat. For a fleeting moment, it looked like she might simply storm off, save face, and pretend it hadn't happened. But pride, especially the kind she wore like a brooch, doesn't retreat. It digs in. And Camilla dug. Her eyes narrowed. Her voice turned sharp and savage. "Traitor!" She said it like a curse, not an accusation. Not shouted, but spit from behind clenched teeth. Disgrace. My husband's guards should be stripped of their rifles if this is what they are. Relics with scripture and arrogance instead of obedience. No one moved. The press gallery didn't blink. The aides looked like statues themselves. Even the guards at the far ends of the courtyard seemed more than ceremonial now, like they were waiting to see who would flinch first. Sergeant Grange did not. He stood as he had since the moment she stepped into view. Eyes forward, body squared, heels locked. But when he spoke again, the weight behind the words made the entire forecourt lean closer. "Your Majesty," he said, calm and clear, "we are not your guards." Camilla's eyes widened. "We are the Queen's guard." "And the Queen who made us—" He paused, just a heartbeat, then delivered it with the finality of a sealed oath. "Was Elizabeth." The silence that followed was total, not awkward, not accidental, earned, the kind of silence that settles over a battlefield before anyone knows which side has won. Camilla's face darkened, her shoulders pulled back. The anger in her voice now had edge, not just wounded pride, but something closer to fear. "Don't lecture me on loyalty. I've walked beside the king through more doors than you've ever stood in front of. I've carried the crown. I've rebuilt this monarchy after your queen left it to rot in tradition and shadows." She turned her head, scanning the aides, daring one of them to back her. None did. One finally tried to speak. "Ma'am, perhaps we should—" But Camilla cut him off with a raised hand. "Every one of these guards thinks silence makes them righteous," she snapped. "But it's weakness. Obedience dressed up as nobility. We don't need statues, we need strength." A small voice from the crowd called out, "He is strong!" Camilla turned toward the rope line, but couldn't tell who'd said it. She looked back at Grange. And what terrified her more than his words was the fact that he was still standing, still unmoved, still silent, not defiant, not rebellious, just rooted, like he was standing for something she couldn't touch. And that's when she realized, the more she spoke, the smaller she looked next to him. The crowd didn't cheer, but they didn't look away. And from the far edge of the courtyard, something shifted. A ripple. An arrival. Footsteps. Deliberate. Measured. The sound of polished leather on ancient stone echoed across the courtyard. Not hurried. Not chaotic. Just controlled, like a man walking into a storm he'd seen coming long before anyone else. Every aide turned. Every phone snapped toward the new figure, cutting across the forecourt in a crisp navy morning coat, the royal crest gleaming faintly on his lapel. Prince William. No ceremony, no entourage, just him, eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in the middle of the palace grounds. He had heard enough before he even reached them. Camilla spotted him and stepped forward at once, pointing an accusatory finger at the still silent guardsman. He defied me. He humiliated me in front of cameras, foreign guests, your family's guests. Remove him at once. William didn't even glance at Grange. His eyes locked onto Camilla's. And when he spoke, it wasn't quiet. It wasn't polished. It wasn't princely. It was raw. You humiliated my mother's memory, not him. The words snapped through the courtyard like a crack of thunder. Even Camilla flinched. William stepped past her slowly, turning until he stood face to face with Sergeant Grange. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The future king gave him a single nod, not of approval, but recognition. Then, without turning his back, William raised his voice for everyone to hear. These guards stand where she stood, in silence, in loyalty, in sacrifice. He turned, this time fully, to face Camilla. And they will never kneel to vanity. The tourists audibly gasped. A few even clapped once, then stopped, realizing where they were. Camilla's mouth opened slightly, stunned. She looked around, searching for some ally, some aide who might still come to her defense. None stepped forward. William's voice hardened. Do you think legacy is an obstacle to your comfort? He asked, every syllable cutting. My mother didn't cling to tradition because it was old. She clung to it because it meant something, because these men, he gestured to the guards, stood for the weight of 1,000 years. Not just pageantry, protection, presence. Camilla swallowed, but William didn't stop. You think ceremony is theatre. But I watched her sign letters to grieving families. I watched her stand beside widows in silence, so long she nearly collapsed. I watched her give this country steadiness when everyone else lost their footing. His voice caught, just for a second, and the crack in it made it more powerful than any rehearsed speech could have been. Do you know what she told me the day before she died? William asked, and the question hung in the air like smoke. She said, the guards will stand long after we're all forgotten. That's the point. They're not standing for us. They're standing for the idea that something can remain unchanged when everything else falls apart. He turned fully to face the crowd now, not just Camilla. She understood what you don't. These men aren't decorations. They're proof. Proof that honour still exists, that oaths still mean something, that a man can choose duty over comfort, silence over spectacle, and stand in the rain for hours because he gave his word. William's hand gestured toward Grange without looking at him. That guard you just tried to humiliate? He lost 2 friends in Helmond, came home with shrapnel still in his shoulder, and when my grandmother asked him to return to ceremonial duty, he didn't ask for glory or recognition, he just said yes, because that's what these men do. Somewhere in the crowd a woman started clapping, slowly at first, then another joined, then more, not loud, not frenzied, just steady and certain. Camilla's face went white. He pointed once, directly at the bearskin-crowned silhouette behind him, and these guards were part of that. She never mocked them. She never demanded they kneel. Camilla stepped back, visibly shaken now. William stepped forward, voice low, just for her. And neither will you. For a moment, the courtyard didn't feel like Buckingham Palace anymore. It felt like judgment. The Queen Consort said nothing. The man she'd tried to disgrace still hadn't moved. And the son of the woman she tried to replace? He'd just spoken for a nation. Camilla's face tightened, her chin raised slightly, the same tilt she'd used in decades past to swat away tabloids and whispers. But now it didn't work. Not against William, not in front of hundreds, and certainly not with a man in red still standing like a monument beside them. She tried to recover. I didn't come here to be scolded by a child still grieving fairy tales, she snapped. This monarchy needs movement, William. It needs to evolve. Your mother froze it in amber. It can't survive in silence. William didn't blink. Silence, he said, voice low, sharp. She survived in silence. You're here throwing stones at the foundation she spent 70 years holding up. Camilla laughed bitterly, waving toward Grange with open contempt. And that foundation, she said, it's crumbling. These men in red coats and tall hats, they aren't soldiers anymore. They're museum pieces, tour guide props. She turned to the crowd now, bold enough to speak for all. This country needs a monarchy that breathes, not one that parades ghosts. That's when the shift happened. Not in Camilla's voice or Grange's posture, but in the crowd itself. A woman near the front, older, maybe 70, with a small Union Jack pinned to her coat, spoke up. Her voice wavered but carried. "My son wore that uniform in Afghanistan." Camilla turned toward her, irritated by the interruption. The woman continued, tears now visible on her cheeks. "He came home in a box." But his mates, they stood at Buckingham. Just like him, she pointed at Grange, they're not ghosts. They're the reason we can stand here safely, mocking them. A ripple moved through the crowd. Others nodded. A man in a veteran's cap removed it, holding it to his chest. Another tourist lowered their phone entirely. Camilla opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the sound of approaching footsteps cut through the tension like a blade. William stepped forward, one foot echoing sharply on the stone. "Then maybe you shouldn't have walked through my mother's house." The courtyard held its breath. "You mock tradition," William said, not shouting but firm. "You ridicule ceremony. You shame guards who stood longer in freezing silence than most ministers stand in office. And you dare call it progress?" He turned to the press, to the crowd, to every camera now fully focused. "My mother gave them purpose. You strip them of dignity." Camilla shook her head, scoffing. "You sound like a boy still living in his mother's shadow." William stepped forward again. Not close enough to intimidate, but close enough to silence her. "No," he said, "I live in the light she left behind." And in that moment, Camilla had nothing. She turned sharply toward her aides, but they didn't move. Tourists watched like it was a coronation or a collapse. Phones filmed it all, trembling hands, open mouths, disbelief burned onto every pixel. William turned back toward Grange. The guardsman hadn't flinched. Not once. Not during the insults. Not during the order to kneel. Not during the Queen Consort's rage. Not even during the future King's defence. He simply stood, and it was more powerful than any speech either of them could give. Camilla finally exhaled, shallow, quick, almost like fear. She looked around one last time at the silent aides, the frozen crowd, the tall black silhouette who wouldn't bow, and realised the power she tried to command was already gone. And the man who stood in silence? He'd just spoken loudest of all. The wind shifted slightly across the Buckingham forecourt, just enough to ripple the red tunic of Sergeant Grange as he stood motionless in the midday sun. His shadow stretched long across the courtyard stone, unmoved by the voices, the spectacle, or the monarchy unravelling in front of him. Prince William turned once more, voice firm but composed. "Sergeant Grange," he said, "you are to remain at your post." Grange didn't salute. He didn't nod. He simply straightened, a movement so subtle only trained eyes would have noticed, and locked back into the stillness that had defined him since the Queen's reign. The order had been given not to remove him, but to preserve him, and everyone understood the meaning. This was no longer about protocol, it was about legacy. Camilla didn't argue. She turned abruptly, heels cracking sharply against the flagstones as she walked away, not toward the front of the palace where she'd entered in control, but toward the side passage, flanked now by aides who followed in silence. She didn't look at the crowd, she didn't wave, she didn't speak another word. One tourist whispered, "She's retreating." Another murmured, "No, she's running." William remained behind for a moment longer, watching her disappear through the palace archway. He didn't look triumphant, he looked tired, not from the confrontation, but from the weight of what it had meant, of who he had just defended, and of who had once stood alone on that same stone, bearing far worse in silence. He stepped beside Grange, just briefly, and spoke quietly so no one but the guard would hear. She would have been proud. Then, without waiting for acknowledgement, William turned and walked back across the courtyard, his stride purposeful, his shoulders squared. The crowd parted for him in stunned silence, cameras still raised, fingers hovering over record buttons like they didn't dare stop. As William passed through the outer gate, a child near the rope line asked softly, "Mummy, was that the king?" The mother, eyes still wet, whispered back, "Not yet. But one day, and thank God for it." Back at centre post, Sergeant Grange remained, still, undefeated, a rifle at his side, boots planted like stone. The bearskin on his head swayed slightly in the breeze, but his eyes didn't move, not even to the crowd who now looked at him like he'd grown 10 feet tall. There was no cheer, no applause, just reverent silence, the kind that belongs to cathedrals or battlefields or Buckingham Palace when something real has just happened. He didn't need to speak again. He didn't need to move, because on a bright spring day when the future queen tried to command the past to kneel, the guard stood taller than the crown itself. Do you think Sergeant Grange was right to defy Queen Camilla's order to kneel? And what about Prince William? Was he too harsh in defending his mother's legacy, or not harsh enough? Let us know what you would have done in the comments below. We read every single one. If you believe the guards still stand for something sacred, hit that like button to show your support. Make sure you're subscribed with the bell icon turned on so you never miss what really happens behind palace walls. And don't keep this story to yourself. Share it with someone who still believes the crown should be earned, not demanded. Another story is already waiting for you on screen. Click to watch it next, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, with a brand new video.